I was in the middle of pressing a batch of apple butter when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I didn't think anything of it. My hands were sticky, the jars were lined up on the towel, and I figured it was my neighbor Ruthie asking again if I had extra canning lids. So I let it buzz. It buzzed again, and then again. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked it up. It was my son-in-law. 3 missed calls in under 2 minutes. My stomach dropped before I even pressed call back. He picked up on the first ring, and his voice was strange, tight and too calm in the way men get when they're trying not to fall apart. "She's at Mercy General. You need to come now." I didn't ask questions. I turned off the stove, grabbed my keys off the hook by the back door, and I drove. My daughter is 34 years old. She has her father's dark eyes and my stubbornness, and she married a man named, well, I'll call him my son-in-law because that's what he is, whatever comes next in this story. He's a good man. I knew that from the first Thanksgiving, he drove 3 hours to have dinner with us and washed every single dish without being asked. You notice things like that when you're a mother. They'd been married 6 years by then, living out in Caldwell County, about 40 minutes from where I grew up. They had a small house on a stretch of land his family had owned for 2 generations, and they were happy. The quiet kind of happy that doesn't make noise, just settles into a life like good furniture. I knew his mother had never warmed to my daughter. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I'm 63 years old, and I've learned that there's a difference between saying something true and saying something fair. So I'll say this. She was a woman who had very specific ideas about what her son's life was supposed to look like, and my daughter, with her career in social work, her natural hair, her way of speaking her mind at Sunday dinner, didn't fit those ideas. The first Christmas, his mother made a comment about my daughter's cornbread. Said it was different. She smiled when she said it, but her eyes didn't. The second Christmas, she asked my son-in-law in front of everyone when they were going to start acting more settled. My daughter had just gotten a promotion. She smiled and passed the sweet potatoes. By the 3rd year, I stopped expecting the woman to change. Some people show you who they are slowly, like a fog rolling in. You don't notice it until you can't see anything clearly anymore. When I got to the hospital, my son-in-law was standing in the hallway outside the ER with his arms crossed over his chest, like he was holding himself together. He had a smear of dried mud on his forearm and his eyes were red. "What happened?" I said. He looked at me for a long second. Then he said, "She was at the property line, down by the creek. She fell." Or, he stopped. They don't know yet if it was a fall. I didn't understand what he meant at first. Then I did. The nurse brought me back. My daughter was lying in the bed, with a bandage around her left wrist and a bruise along her cheekbone the color of a plum. She turned her head when I walked in, and her eyes filled up, and I walked straight to her and took her hand. She was 34 years old. She looked like she was 12. "Mom," she said. "I'm here," I said. "I'm right here." She didn't speak for a minute. I sat on the edge of the plastic chair and held her hand and let her breathe. There's a thing you learn as a mother, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just stay still and let your child find their words. So I waited. Finally, she said, "She told me I deserved it. I thought I'd heard her wrong." "What?" "His mother." My daughter's voice was very quiet, almost a whisper. She said my kind of blood always finds trouble. That I deserved whatever came to me. I sat very still. "She was there," my daughter said. "Mom, she was there at the creek." I will tell you what I did not do in that moment. I did not stand up and start shouting. I did not call my son-in-law back into the room and make a scene. I did not cry, even though I could feel something in my chest that wanted to become crying. What I did was squeeze my daughter's hand once, and then I said, "Tell me everything, and don't leave anything out." She had gone down to the creek that afternoon to get some quiet. They'd had a hard week. There was a disagreement with my son-in-law's family about Thanksgiving plans, and she needed an hour of air and water sounds. She told me she'd done it 100 times. That particular trail down to the creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, through a grove of old sycamores, and she'd walked it so many times she knew every route. His mother had called that morning and asked to come by. My son-in-law was at work. My daughter said she could come at 2. She didn't come at 2. She came at 4:30, when the light was already going low, and she didn't come to the front door. My daughter heard footsteps on the trail and thought it was a neighbor's dog. It wasn't a neighbor's dog. She said his mother appeared at the edge of the sycamores like she'd been standing there for a while, just watching. My daughter said hello and asked if she'd knocked and hadn't heard, and his mother said no, said she'd walked the back way in from the road, said she wanted to talk privately. What followed, my daughter told me in pieces, because she was still shaking and her memory of it came in pieces. There were words, ugly words, words I had heard before in my life, but had hoped my daughter wouldn't have to hear, aimed at her like that. Words about blood and worth and what she was and wasn't. Words that had been building up behind that woman's careful smiles for 6 years. And then there was a push. My daughter isn't sure exactly how it happened. She said she was stepping back, trying to get distance, and the ground was uneven near the creek bank. She went down hard, hit her wrist on a root, hit her cheek on something. A rock, maybe. She landed in the shallow water at the edge, and the cold of it shocked her, and she couldn't get her breath. And his mother stood at the top of the bank and looked down at her. She said it again then, my daughter told me. She said, "You deserve this," and then she left. My daughter lay in that cold creek water for almost 20 minutes before she was able to drag herself up the bank. She walked back to the house. She called my son-in-law. He drove home from across the county in 18 minutes and called the ambulance. That's how I found out. My son-in-law had questions. The police had questions. The doctor had questions. Everyone had questions, and I sat in the waiting room and answered what I could, and when everyone else was done asking questions, I went back in with my daughter, and I sat with her until she fell asleep. Then I went out to the parking lot and I called my brother. He's 71 years old. He spent 30 years as an investigator for the State Insurance Commission. He is the most methodical, patient man I have ever known, and he is also the person who, when I was 8 years old and a boy on our street took my bicycle, tracked that boy down and stood on his porch until the bicycle was returned. He has never once in his life let something wrong. Just sit there. When he answered, I said, "I need you," he said. "Tell me." I told him. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "Are there cameras at the property?" "A doorbell camera," I said. "I don't know what it caught." "When can you get into the house?" "Tomorrow." "I'll be there at 8, he said. "Don't touch anything. Don't talk to her. Don't let her lawyer tell you anything is settled." That was all he said. But I knew what he meant. I knew what we were doing. My son-in-law let us into the house the next morning. My daughter was still at the hospital for observation. My brother arrived at 8 o'clock exactly in his gray Ford, and his reading glasses on a chain around his neck. And he shook my son-in-law's hand and said, "I'm going to need to see everything." The doorbell camera had footage. It was time-stamped. It showed his mother arriving at the front door at 2:15, ringing the bell once, and then, when no one answered, walking around the side of the house instead of leaving. She didn't knock again. She didn't call out. She went around. "She knew your daughter was home," my brother said, watching the footage on the laptop. "She saw her car." There was more. My son-in-law's phone records showed that his mother had called him 6 times in the 2 hours. Before my daughter went to the hospital, starting about 15 minutes after my daughter had been at the creek, before my son-in-law even knew anything had happened, she was calling to tell her version of events before anyone else could tell theirs. My brother wrote all of this down in a spiral notebook in his small, precise handwriting. "This isn't just a family matter," he said. "This is assault. Depending on what the DA decides, it could be more." My son-in-law sat at his kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood. "My mother," he started. "I know," my brother said, not unkindly. "It's your mother. That doesn't change what she did." He nodded, slowly. And then he said, "I know." I want to be honest about the next few weeks because they weren't simple. There were people, friends of his mother, people from the church she'd attended for 30 years, who said it was a misunderstanding, that my daughter must have been unsteady on the bank, that his mother was a church elder, for goodness' sake. That family matters should stay in the family. His aunt called me directly. Said that what I was doing was tearing the family apart. Said that my daughter had always been difficult. Said the word difficult, like it explained everything, like it was a diagnosis. I let her talk. Then I said, I've been watching someone be called difficult for 6 years for doing nothing more than existing in a space where she wasn't wanted. I'm done being polite about that. And I hung up. My daughter heard about that later. She laughed. The first real laugh I'd heard from her since the hospital. She said, "Mom, you actually said that?" And I said, "I did." And she reached over and squeezed my hand. The police filed charges, assault causing bodily harm. The DA's office looked at the footage, looked at the phone records, looked at the timeline, and they saw what my brother had seen. His mother hired a lawyer. Here is what I've thought about many times since then. There is a particular kind of cruelty that wears patience like a costume. It learns to smile. It learns to say the right things at the right volume. It waits. It was waiting for 6 years in this case, waiting for a moment when my daughter was alone, when the ground was uneven, when no one else was watching. What it didn't wait for was my brother. What it didn't wait for was the timestamp on a doorbell camera. What it didn't wait for was a 63-year-old woman with nothing left to lose and nowhere else to be except exactly where her daughter needed her. The case didn't go to trial. 3 months later, his mother accepted a plea, community service, a restraining order, no contact with my daughter for 3 years. Her church gave her a leave of absence. Her friends from the garden club stopped calling. I don't take pleasure in that. I want to say that plainly because I was raised by a woman who told me that satisfaction in someone else's suffering is a small thing to feel, and I've tried to live by that. But I do take something in watching the truth be seen, just seen, exactly as it is. My son-in-law moved my daughter out of that house. They live now in a town about an hour north, a little colonial on a street with sidewalks and a good school district. My daughter started working with a therapist. She runs a support group on Thursday evenings for women navigating family estrangement, and the room fills up every week. My brother came for Thanksgiving. He brought a sweet potato casserole and a bottle of wine, and we sat around the table. My daughter, my son-in-law, my brother, my daughter's closest friend from college, and me, and we ate until we were full. And then we sat talking until well past 9. At one point, my daughter looked around the table and said, "I used to think something was wrong with me, for not being accepted, for not being enough." Nobody spoke. "I don't think that anymore," she said. And my brother reached across the table and touched her hand, just briefly, and said, "You never should have. I'm 63 years old. I've watched a lot of things come and go. I've watched people I loved get worn down by the weight of other people's contempt, and I've watched some of them decide they were too tired to fight back. I understand that. I've been tired too. But I've also watched what happens when somebody decides that tired doesn't mean done. My daughter is not the woman she was before that afternoon at the creek." That's true. Some things change you, and there's no going back to who you were before, but she is not smaller either. If anything, she is more herself than she's ever been, more certain of her own worth, more clear-eyed about what she will and won't accept. She calls me every Sunday. We talk for an hour, sometimes more. She tells me about the women in her Thursday group, about the slow work of helping someone believe they were never the problem. She tells me about the small victories. A new casserole she's been perfecting, a trail she found near their new house that runs along a creek. "I still like creeks," she told me once, like she wanted me to know that hadn't been taken from her. "Good," I said. "Do you remember when you used to take me to Granger Creek when I was little? We'd catch crawdads and you'd let me stay until my shoes were soaked." I did remember. I remember exactly. You told me the water always finds its way, she said. I had said that. I didn't remember saying it, but I believed it then and I believe it now. The water always finds its way, and so, eventually, does the truth.